Why Princess Leonor of Asturias, love life is a matter of state. Picture the steel-gray dawn over the Bay of Cadiz. The air tastes faintly of salt and diesel, and somewhere beyond the harbor wall a naval training ship sits almost motionless, until you notice the tiny movements that give away everything. A line of young cadets shifting their weight in unison, a glance held a fraction too long, a smile that arrives and disappears before any camera can claim it. And here's the detail almost nobody outside the corridors of power, in Washington, London, Ottawa, Canberra, or Berlin, really understands. In Spain, for the heir to the throne, romance isn't just romance. It can become a constitutional question, a security question, a continuity question. Because when the young woman at the center of that scene is Princess Leonor of Asturias, even the most ordinary human impulse, to like someone, to trust someone, to choose someone, can ripple outward until it reaches Parliament, the armed forces, the press, the economy, and the very argument for why a monarchy still exists in modern Europe. This is the story of why Princess Leonor of Asturias, love life is a matter of state, and why the simplest headline the internet loves to trade in, is never the real headline. It's love versus duty, not in the melodramatic way, not in the tabloid way, in the institutional way, where centuries of tradition meet state law, where national identity is woven into rituals that look decorative until the day they suddenly aren't. And if you think that sounds exaggerated, then let me ask you something, quietly, as one friend to another. What happens if the future Queen of Spain falls in love with the wrong person? Not morally wrong, but constitutionally complicated. What happens if she chooses a private life that makes perfect sense to you and me, but forces the state to choose between her happiness and the monarchy's stability? Because the real prize here, the thing everyone in Spain is protecting, whether they admit it or not, is continuity. Not the gossip, not the fairy tale. Continuity embodied in a living person, moving through the world with a spotlight on her that never truly switches off. And the first cliff edge comes sooner than you think. They can keep her schedule public. They can keep her speeches polished. They can keep the photos carefully framed. But can they keep her heart safe for the institution, without turning that institution into something the public stops accepting? Hold that thought. Now, if you've watched Leonor's public life over the last few years, it can feel almost choreographed into inevitability. There's the solemn oath-like cadence of state events. The training milestones. The steady transition from princess as symbol to princess as future commander-in-chief figure, future head of state, future anchor of a constitutional system. Spain, like other parliamentary monarchies, doesn't ask its monarch to govern day-to-day policy. That's the elected government's job. But it does ask for something stranger and, in a way, more fragile: legitimacy without voting. Continuity without campaigning. National identity without partisanship. And that's why love, of all things, becomes political. Because marriage, for an heir, isn't only a personal commitment. It's a public contract with consequences. It's the creation of a second pole of the crown, the consort, the family, the future children, the line of succession, the long-term image of stability. In the US, people often underestimate how much symbolism is actually power. In the UK, they understand it instinctively, because they've watched how marriages can steady the institution or shake it. Canada and Australia, watching from across the Commonwealth's long shadow, tend to read these moments as tests of modern relevance. Can monarchy look contemporary without unraveling its own logic? Germany, with its own constitutional culture shaped by history, often interprets monarchy stories less as celebrity and more as a stress test of institutions, how systems handle tradition, scrutiny, and the rule of law. Spain sits right at that intersection: modern democracy, deep history, and a monarchy that has had to justify itself repeatedly in living memory. So when people ask, who is Leonor dating? They're usually asking the wrong question. The real question is, what kind of future does her choice of partner imply, and can the institution absorb it? Because every choice she makes will not only shape her own destiny but could redefine the monarchy's role in a modern Europe. And that brings us to the part that's always whispered, rarely stated out loud. There is a silent job description attached to the Princess of Asturias. It includes discipline, discretion, and a kind of emotional stamina most adults never develop. It includes learning to hold warmth without being familiar, to be relatable without being casual, to seem spontaneous while never truly being unplanned. It also includes being, in a sense, the state's most visible private citizen. Which sounds like a contradiction, until you realize that contradiction is the point. And here's the first uncomfortable truth. The more the public wants her to be normal, the more the state needs her to be exceptional. So when a rumor flares up, when a name trends, when a blurry photo circulates, when the internet tries to match a face to a fantasy, it isn't just gossip. It's a small earthquake in the relationship between monarchy and society. Because the monarchy survives on a bargain, we accept you as a symbol of unity, you accept limits that ordinary people don't have to accept. And if that bargain begins to feel unfair, outdated, or opaque, support can soften. If it begins to feel like the crown is asking a young woman to sacrifice the basic human right to choose freely, it can harden into resentment. And if it begins to feel like the crown is bending rules for convenience, it can harden into distrust. Either way, the love story becomes a political story. And at around the 2-minute mark, here's the cliffhanger I want to leave hanging in the air. If Leonor's love life is hers, then why does the state have a stake in it at all? And what, exactly, would the state do if her private choice threatened public continuity? Because the answer is where this gets serious. Spain's monarchy is constitutional. It's wrapped in law, ceremony, and expectations. And while modern Spain is not arranging marriages like a medieval court, it still treats the heir's marriage as something that touches the state. Not because Spain wants to control her. Because Spain is trying to control the future. And that's the same logic that shapes every royal household from London to Oslo to The Hague. The institution doesn't fear love. It fears unpredictability. Unpredictability is poison to continuity. Now, let's talk about what matter of state really means in practice, without slipping into sensationalism. It means security. A partner becomes a security variable. Their background, their associates, their online history, their vulnerabilities. In a world where reputations can be attacked through disinformation, where foreign influence operations look for human entry points, where a single hacked phone can become a national scandal, a royal partner isn't just a romantic interest. They're a potential access point. And yes, observers in the US and UK frame this moment differently, yet the continuity echoes across continents. Americans often see it through the lens of privacy versus public scrutiny, a celebrity culture with political undertones. Britons see it through the lens of precedent, what happens when personal choices collide with institutional expectation. In Canada and Australia, there's a more detached question that always hovers: what's the point of monarchy if it can't adapt? But also, what happens to a constitutional system when its symbol becomes unstable? Germany's political culture, shaped by a firm attachment to constitutional resilience, tends to read these royal narratives as civic psychology. How does a society maintain trust in institutions when personal lives become public battlegrounds? Spain has to answer all of that, while also answering itself. Because Spanish history has made the idea of continuity both precious and precarious. And this is not just ceremony, it is the living thread of continuity. Now, there's a second layer, less discussed, more emotionally charged. Leonor is not just a young woman in the spotlight. She is the future of a symbol that has to stand above politics while being constantly interpreted politically. Every handshake becomes a headline, every outfit becomes a message, every friendship becomes speculation, every smile becomes evidence. So imagine what dating becomes. If she is seen with someone, it's a story. If she is not seen with someone, it's also a story. If she appears relaxed, it's a story. If she appears disciplined, it's a story. In that sense, the institution is always playing defense. And here's where the pressure becomes historical, not personal. Royal households have long understood something that modern democracies sometimes forget: the personal is geopolitical when the person is the symbol. Marriage can align soft power. It can signal stability. It can avoid scandal. It can also ignite it. It can become a lightning rod for culture wars: tradition versus modernity, privacy versus transparency, feminism versus duty, love versus protocol. And because Leonor is young, because she's the first in her generation, because Spain is watching her become real in real time, the scrutiny is sharper than it might be for an older monarch whose mystique has already set like stone. If you've ever wondered why her public path leans so heavily into institutional competence, military training, formal engagements, careful speeches, it's because competence is the shield. Competence is how the monarchy says, "We are serious." Competence is how it earns patience. And competence is how it tries to keep the love life from becoming the main story. But here comes the twist. The more competent and disciplined she appears, the more the public starts to ask for the last thing that feels human and unscripted: romance. So the system that protects her also creates the conditions for obsession. Which brings us right to the thumbnail gravity center again, because whether people admit it or not, what they're watching is love versus duty. And at around 5 minutes, here's the second cliffhanger. If the monarchy needs Leonor to embody stability, can she ever choose a partner freely, without that partner becoming part of the institution, whether they want it or not? Now, let's get specific in a way that stays respectful and advertiser safe. There is a reason official channels almost never confirm rumors about royal relationships, especially at Leonor's stage. Confirmation turns private speculation into public fact. Public fact triggers security protocols, political commentary, and a permanent record. It creates stakes where the household would prefer ambiguity. So what do people do instead? They hunt for clues. And if you want to understand why the love life becomes a matter of state, you have to understand the 3 types of clues that modern royal watching runs on. First, body language in high control environments. When Leonor appears at formal events, her posture is trained. Her expressions are measured, but humans still leak signals. Micro smiles, a softened gaze, a moment of ease that looks different from duty. Viewers in the US might read that as celebrity decoding: who is she looking at? Viewers in the UK are almost trained by decades of royal coverage to interpret it as court dynamics: who is placed near her? Canada and Australia often watch for the tone: does she look comfortable in her role? Germany watches for the institution: does the protocol hold? Second, media reporting patterns. Not the loudest stories, the patterns. When certain outlets speculate, when others refuse, when language becomes oddly consistent across publications, when the palace responds by saying nothing at all. Silence becomes a tool. And in monarchy, silence is never empty. It's a way to avoid turning a private person into a public asset. Third, protocol highlights. Where is she seated? Who is in the official photo? Who is not? Who gets a handshake that becomes a headline? Who is invited to what, and when? If you think that's too granular, remember, national identity is woven into these rituals, binding past and present in a single moment. The ritual is the message. And rituals are how states communicate without issuing statements. Now, here's what makes Leonor's story especially sensitive. She is growing into her role during a time when privacy is harder than ever to defend. A single classmate, a single group photo, a single casual comment can become a global story within hours. A single rumor can be translated, amplified, and reinterpreted across borders. And once it hits Washington, London, Ottawa, Canberra, and Berlin, once it becomes international, it begins to reflect back on Spain's image abroad: modernity, stability, seriousness. This is why royal households sometimes appear cold. They are not trying to crush humanity. They are trying to manage a global narrative that can affect trust at home. Because trust is the monarchy's oxygen. Now let's lean into the question that everyone thinks is the question, and gently reveal why it isn't. People want a name, but the institution cares about categories. Is the potential partner a private citizen who can withstand scrutiny? Are they connected to political factions? Are they linked to business interests? Do they have vulnerabilities that hostile actors could exploit? Are they willing to live inside limits that most people would find suffocating? And then, the most delicate category of all. Would the public accept them? Because public acceptance isn't just popularity. It's legitimacy. And legitimacy is continuity. Around 8 minutes, here's the third cliffhanger. If the right partner for Leonor is someone the public accepts, who decides what acceptable means, and what happens if Leonor's own definition doesn't match the institution's? Now we arrive at the part that feels like it belongs in a private conversation, not a documentary. But it's the key. The monarchy doesn't need Leonor to be loved like a celebrity. It needs her to be trusted like an institution. That's why the love life becomes a matter of state. Because a marriage isn't just about romance, it's about the next 50 years of symbolism. It's about the future children who might inherit the crown. It's about whether the Spanish public sees the next generation as grounded, stable, and representative of a modern Spain, without severing the thread of tradition. This is not just ceremony, it is the living thread of continuity. And here's where the tension becomes almost unfairly personal. Leonor has been shaped, from childhood, to represent Spain without belonging to any one part of it. She must be close enough to feel national, but distant enough to remain neutral. She must be modern enough to be relevant, but traditional enough to feel like continuity. Now place romance inside that. If she dates someone too ordinary, people may romanticize it, until they resent the security costs, the loss of privacy, the pressure on that person, and the risk of scandal. If she dates someone too elite, people may criticize it as out of touch, even if it makes institutional life smoother. If she dates someone foreign, it becomes international conversation, sometimes warm, sometimes suspicious, sometimes openly political. And every option is interpreted through the lens of Spain's future. So at the midpoint, around 10 or 11 minutes, let's escalate, because this is where the stakes sharpen. Here's the tease that matters. The biggest risk to Leonor's future is not a rumor. It's a mismatch between the pace of her personal life and the pace of the institution. Institutions move slowly. Human hearts do not. If the institution tries to freeze her personal life until it's convenient, it risks looking inhumane and outdated. If it allows her personal life to unfold naturally, it risks unpredictability. And unpredictability is the one thing constitutional symbolism can't tolerate for long. This is why the palace will always prefer ambiguity, gradualism, and controlled visibility. It's also why the public will always push for clarity, authenticity, and realness. Those forces collide, quietly, constantly. And if you're thinking, so what's the actual consequence? Here it is. The consequence is the monarchy's narrative. A monarchy does not survive on policy wins. It survives on story. A story of service. A story of restraint. A story of national continuity. A love story can support that, if it looks stable, dignified, and aligned with duty. Or it can challenge it, if it looks chaotic, secretive, or at odds with institutional expectations. And because Spain is not an island, because its economy, diplomacy, and image are interlinked with the rest of Europe and the wider democratic world, this narrative matters beyond Spanish borders. Canada and Australia see this gesture as symbolic, but Germany interprets it as constitutional resilience. The gesture might be nothing more than silence, or a carefully staged photo, or a deliberate absence, but states read symbols like language. Now, if we're honest, the most fascinating part of this isn't whether Leonor is dating today. It's what her eventual choice will signal. Will she choose a partner who becomes an extension of the institution, disciplined, discreet, almost professionally royal? Or will she choose someone who forces the institution to modernize its expectations in public? Either path could strengthen the monarchy. Either path could destabilize it. It depends on timing, transparency, and trust. And at around 14 minutes, here's the next cliffhanger. What if the most modern choice Leonor could make, the most relatable, the most human, ends up being the choice that puts the monarchy's continuity under the most pressure? Because modernity is not automatically stabilizing. Sometimes modernity is volatility with better branding. Now let's widen the lens, because this story isn't just about a young woman. It's about Spain itself, what Spain wants to preserve, and what Spain is willing to change. Spain's monarchy exists in a democratic ecosystem where skepticism can be rational and support must be earned. That makes Leonor's image management both more necessary and more delicate than in eras when deference was automatic. When she appears in uniform, when she stands at attention, when she speaks with that controlled calm, she is not just learning ceremony. She is signaling that the crown understands the state, that it respects the armed forces without politicizing them, that it can represent unity without dictating policy. In other words, continuity, competence, restraint. And here's the quiet truth: romance is the one storyline that can cut across all of that discipline instantly. Because romance is emotional, and emotion travels faster than institutions. A single perceived misstep can become a national debate about values, tradition, feminism, autonomy, privilege, responsibility. In the US, the debate would likely sound like, why should anyone's personal life be a public concern? In the UK, it might sound like, we've seen what happens when the institution fails to adapt, or adapts too late. In Canada and Australia, it might surface as, what is the crown for, exactly, in the 21st century? And Germany might watch with a different kind of interest. How does a constitutional framework absorb intense public scrutiny without destabilizing the political center? Spain hears all of those voices, but it must answer in Spanish terms: history, legitimacy, continuity. And that's why advisors think in decades, not headlines. They ask, what does Spain need from Leonor at 30? At 40? At 60? And then they ask, what choices today make those futures easier, or harder? This is not just ceremony, it is the living thread of continuity. Now, let's talk about the part nobody loves to talk about, because it sounds too calculating for something as human as love. Risk management. For an heir, love is not just a joy. It's a liability profile. Not because love is bad. Because love creates attachment, and attachment can be exploited. If you want to understand the cold logic behind palace caution, imagine a hostile media ecosystem or a foreign intelligence service trying to create leverage. It doesn't even require a scandal. It can be as simple as private messages leaked out of context, a friend of a friend with access, a digital trail from years ago. Even if the partner is perfectly honorable, the environment is not. So the institution acts preemptively. And preemptive caution looks, from the outside, like control. That's the tension. And around 19 minutes, here's the safe foreshadow, because we can see where this is going even without any confirmed romance at all. At some point, Leonor will likely be introduced to Spain not just as a future queen, but as a future queen with a private life that can no longer be kept private. When that day comes, the palace won't simply be sharing news. It will be asking the public to accept a new chapter of continuity. And acceptance will depend on whether the public feels respected, whether they feel the institution has been honest enough, modern enough, and dignified enough. Because if the public feels managed, it resists. If the public feels included, it stabilizes. And that brings us back, one more time, to the central gravity point. Love versus duty is not a slogan in Leonor's life. It's an ongoing negotiation between a person and a state. Between the human need to choose and the institutional need to endure. And now, in the final stretch, I want you to notice something subtle about how royal continuity actually works. It doesn't rely on grand declarations. It relies on repeated, boring, disciplined visibility. It relies on ritual, on calm, on a sense that tomorrow will look broadly like today, even as the world changes. That's why, for centuries, monarchies have treated marriage as a public stabilizer. Not because they worship tradition for tradition's sake, but because they understand narrative as governance adjacent. A stable marriage projects stability. A chaotic romantic storyline projects uncertainty. And uncertainty invites debate. Debate invites politicization. Politicization destroys neutrality. Neutrality is the monarchy's core function. So yes, Princess Leonor of Asturias' love life is more than personal. It reflects centuries of royal tradition, state law, and Spain's future. Every choice she makes will not only shape her own destiny but could redefine the monarchy's role in a modern Europe. That's the legacy axis, quiet, constant, unavoidable. And now, with the last minute approaching, we need to lock it in. Love versus duty, for the third time, and this time with the real meaning attached, is the question of whether Spain can modernize the crown without dissolving the very continuity that makes the crown work. Whether the institution can protect a young woman's humanity while still protecting the state's symbolism. Whether national identity can remain woven into these rituals without the rituals becoming a cage. And here's the forward-looking cliffhanger I want to leave you with, because the next episode of this story isn't about a rumor, or a photo, or a trending name. It's about timing. When Leonor eventually chooses to make any relationship visible, intentionally or by circumstance, will Spain experience it as a reassuring evolution of the monarchy? Or as the moment the institution finally admits that continuity, in the modern world, can no longer be managed from behind palace walls? Because once the heir's private life becomes public fact, the state doesn't just watch. The state responds. And the way Spain responds may tell Washington, London, Ottawa, Canberra, and Berlin something deeper than gossip ever could. Whether the Spanish monarchy is entering its strongest era of modern legitimacy, or stepping onto the most fragile ground it has faced in a generation.